This video is brought to you by Patreon provider Lars.
Oh dear, oh my, I spot something with my eye that can't be right. What is that smudge on the glass? Or is it on the glass? I'll let you know right now, it is not on the glass. In fact, that is inside the scope. I've checked this thing over about 14 times, and it is definitely not on the exterior. Let's see what happens when we zoom in. Oh, look at that. It moves along with the magnification ring. So that is very clearly inside the scope. See if we can get a better image of it. There we go. Look at that. And we zoom in and we zoom out. Now I will admit, you see, whoa. This is actually on my wall, whereas that little black smudge is not. So, off to a fantastic start.
Well, with all of that being said, what are we left with? Well, we're left with a second focal plane reticle that does not change size per magnification like you see here. And speaking of the reticle really quickly, I don't mind it, though it's not my ideal favorite. There are some attributes about it that I really like, some not so much. As far as illumination goes, there it is at its maximum, where on this table I have the camera settings set in a way where it's kind of like late evening, not really dark, so take that for what it is. With the lights out, you can see that it is at least fairly sharp and it doesn't really bleed out that much. But yet again, the camera settings here are a little bit darker than they would be, like, let's say, during the laundry room clearing, which you will see soon enough. But enough of this, let's see how these turrets sound. So as you can hear, the turrets sound really good. They actually feel really good too. Not bad for a $400 scope.
Illumination is as good as it's going to get. Don't expect much more. And because there's an MOA turret and reticle, it's not going to line up properly, but we can at least see how well it tracks. Well, that's all we have for down, or rather up. And that's all we have for down. So it goes past 0, or it goes past where the internal mechanism is not going to be turning the glass, and then it catches back up. It does, however, return to its original 0. Going to the right.
Honestly, so far so good. It tracks well, the reticle looks pretty good, and the illumination works pretty good as well. Now, let's take a look at it a little bit more in depth in some real-world environments. And before we actually talk about that, I have to mention how much of the scope body you can see. You could fine-tune this a little bit better, but as you progress through the magnification range from 1 to 4.5, it does start to get a little bit dark in some of the edges. So this is basically as good as it's going to get. And for me, that's actually a very big disappointment. Why? Well, picture this. If the image that we're seeing through the scope stretched to the outermost edge of the body of the scope, it would be that much bigger and that much wider. You could see that much more through it. What we have right now is a little disappointing because of how much smaller the image is while we look through it. Speaking of slightly disappointing, there's the illumination on maximum. And keep in mind this is a very overcast day, clearly many months ago, because the trees are still all bare. Again, Lars, I'm sorry for having the scope as long as I did, so I greatly appreciate your patience and your time. Pay close attention to the power lines, which are 30 yards away, that they do have some warping to them as we go towards the extreme ends of the scope. So a little bit of fisheyeing is definitely in the cards. One thing to say that is pretty nice is at least the Eyebox so far seems pretty forgiving when we go side to side at 1x. I also like the fact that the illumination is still on and visible when you're into the shadows, so you can at least use it properly with both eyes open. We take the scope up to its maximum magnification of 4.5x, and the image looks pretty good. But keep in mind, this is a side focus model, so I play around with the side focus until I get it as sharp as I can to the naked eye, and I have to say, I think it looks really, really good. And honestly, it should look really good, because we're only at 4.5x at 30 yards. There are other optics I've reviewed at 6, 8x, 30 yards that still look really good, albeit maybe not as good as this does because of the side focus that it has, but still, it's not asking that much of the optic. This is a $400 optic, and it should look this good even without a side focus in my opinion. But the side focus is there for some of you out there that need it for closer engagements, so we'll be getting a little bit closer later on. But when I have it set perfectly focused for 30 yards, here at 400, the image still looks absolutely fantastic. I didn't touch anything. You saw it. I just panned across and down, and that was it. Almost makes you wonder why you really need to get it much better. But here I try to get it much better, and ultimately, I don't think it really does much to improve upon the image quality from when it was set at 30 yards. And that makes me wonder, if it's really good at 30 yards, why not set it from the factory around 30 yards and have it still be that good at 400? It really does make me wonder. The brown muddled mess of the dead trees, you can clearly see the larger branches standing out with ease. And when we pan up to the 800-yard power towers out there in the distance, they look absolutely fantastic. I have zero complaints with the image quality here, with the exception of maybe the edge gets a little bit soft, as you can see it there. So before I stop talking to let you enjoy this beautiful ambiance, just note the illumination is on full. Pay attention to the fence on the inside. You can see just how much it warps towards the edge.
One, two, three, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Maximum brightness.
Holy bleed out, Batman! As I was saying on my tabletop, the brightness settings for my camera there were set for a much brighter environment, whereas where they're set up for here is basically as bright as it'll get for this darker environment. As a result, you can see even with the illumination slightly less than top, we get a lot of bleed out. Once we get into a slightly brighter environment, however, it's not as noticeable, but it's still there. Fisheyeing, however, is also something that is very apparent in these very close environments. You can clearly see it right there in the door jamb, the door, everything sort of starts to just pull itself into a not so great looking image. Parallax is set down pretty close, probably about 10 yards here. So as far as the image quality goes in that regard, it looks pretty good. But that being said, the illumination holds up fairly well. It's just that you're going to get bleed out, which is unfortunate.
Pew pew, pew pew.
Finally trying to adjust the illumination a little bit to prevent it because I still couldn't look through the damn thing. The only problem is now it's a little bit too dark and it doesn't stand out as much as it could.
Pew pew, pew pew.
From one dark environment to the next, we find ourselves in the garage. Except the garage is significantly brighter than the laundry room/storage room. You can tell that the illumination here is set pretty high because you can clearly see the bleed out. Once I drop it down, it goes away and gets better. Unlike the fisheye, which is always there. And once you really start to pick up on it, you can't really get away from it, at least at the lower magnifications.
Pew. Pew.
I know there are people out there that say that they like seeing a lot of the scope body, it helps them line up with the scope. But for me, it's just such a deterrent and it takes away from the entire experience, especially when the image looking through it seems small by comparison.
Pew.
In my humble opinion, there's nothing better than having a 1x that extends all the way to the edge of the scope and is just perfect in every single way. It's such a joy to have.
Pew pew, pew pew.
I've decided to leave a little bit longer segments in there of just pure ambiance like that to give you, the viewer, a little bit better sense of using it. So this way you don't have to listen to me yap this entire length of time. Anyway, my home away from home, the 50-yard line at my local range. There is your maximum illumination on this slightly overcast day, and it's really not that impressive. Unfortunately so, it's just the way it is. One thing I can state that's a little bit different is that the black above the berm, you can see, doesn't have any sort of shift when we pan across it. That's about the only thing I could really say it's a compliment, or at least not a detriment to the scope. Aside from that, there's still some strong fisheyeing to it, which is unfortunate. Alright, let's bring this up to its maximum magnification of 4.5x and play with the side focus. This first target that we're looking at is about 15 yards or so away, the one on the back is 50 yards. This scope has a very large sweep between its minimum to maximum focus setting, so this should allow us to get a really, really high level of sharpness, or at least to what the optic will allow us to get on these targets. Like you saw earlier, at 30 yards, it's pretty sharp from 30 to 400. Here, when we get in at 15 yards at its maximum magnification, the 50-yard line does seem like it's a little bit out of focus. So, if you're wondering what sort of plane you're going to have at its maximum magnification, that's about it. If we were to decrease the magnification, back it out a little bit, this wouldn't be as noticeable. So if you're going to be shooting a competition at a known magnification, at a known distance, you set it, you forget it, and you have yourself a really good looking image. Alright, time to move on to the all-important Eyebox test. Here at 1x it's actually pretty good. It allows you to get pretty close to it or pretty far away while still managing to look through it. Illumination is visible even in the shadows like I showcased earlier, but once you step off to the side at any sort of distance away, it becomes a little bit more challenging. You might have also noted that the image looking through it at 1x could be a little bit better than what you've been seeing, but once you increase the magnification slightly like you have here to 2x, that all changes. At 2x the Eyebox does get a little bit tighter, but it's still fairly decent. Off to the sides, it's a little bit more sensitive than it is at 1x, and at least you can still see the illumination, albeit it's still not that bright. Bringing it up to its maximum magnification, 4.5x, and it's actually a pretty good performance. Better than what I would have thought considering the 2x on this thing. Overall, if you were in a pretty harsh position and couldn't really get a good cheek weld on it, I think you'd be able to look through the scope fairly well. LPVOs are designed to be fast and easy. Simple as it can be, because the last thing you want to do is have to worry about making too many adjustments in an environment. Yes, this scope allows you to make those finite adjustments if you're using it at a particular distance, at a particular magnification, for a particular time, a particular environment. As you can see, it's very particular, and that's not what an LPVO should be, or at least in my opinion. Now, I'm not saying that this scope is garbage and no one should buy it. If it fits your needs and roles, great. But just don't buy this for the sake of saying, oh, well, I think I could use the side focus in a multitude of environments. That's not necessarily a benefit. Sometimes having too many options leaves you to not be proficient at anything, and then you're left with your thumb up your ass, constantly trying to make micro adjustments for your situation. What I'm trying to say, this isn't for everybody, so don't just buy this on a splurge thinking that it's going to be perfect for you. And with that, enjoy the rest of this ambiance before we get into my final thoughts.
There's a seat for every ass, and there's an ass for every seat. Those are words that my grandpa told me a very long time ago, and they stuck like glue. What it basically means is just because something isn't right for you doesn't mean that it might not be right for somebody else. This Athlon Helos BTR was sent in by Patreon provider Lars, and when he first told me what was coming, I was very intrigued because I didn't know what to make of this thing on paper, let alone actually getting my hands on it and using it. It has some features that I don't necessarily agree with, but it doesn't mean that you don't agree with it. I think there is a very specific role for this scope for somebody, just not me. You do see a lot of the scope body behind it and a very small window looking through it, and the glass isn't really all that, wow, look at that, it's really good. Overall, this might not fit my role, but it might fit yours. It might fit Lars's as well. But nevertheless, I'm still not blown away by any of the real characteristics behind it. The illumination is weak, the reticle's The glass is only okay, I would say. I mean, it tracks well, but as a whole, this thing does nothing for me. Do I recommend it? Only if you need everything that this scope offers. Other than that, I would say look elsewhere. There are plenty of other options in this extremely large, vast LPVO world that we have, and it's only ever growing, which is great, because what works for you might not work for somebody else. So hopefully there's something out there that'll fit your needs. If this is one of them, you have all the facts laid out in front of you, so hopefully you can make an educated choice based on that. As far as the weight, it's not even that light. Almost 23 ounces is ridiculously heavy. You can get an AccuPower 1 to 8 for only 2 ounces heavier, and this thing is absolutely fantastic. Granted, about 3 times the price, but this thing blows this thing out of the water. It's like this thing is trying to replicate this with half the magnification at just shy of half the price, and it just doesn't work. So a huge thank you to Patreon provider Lars for sending this into review. I'm sorry that I don't really care for the scope, but if it works for you and you love it, more power to you. I'm really happy for you. So with that, thank you very much for watching. See you again next time.
And a very huge thank you to all of my Patreon providers. Without you, this wouldn't be possible. If you'd like to help support the channel but don't want to join my Patreon, I completely understand. But you can still help support by using my affiliate links in the description below. Thanks again for watching.